He had everything: the empire, the penthouse, the perfect wife carrying his child, and he threw it all away for a woman who never loved him. If you've ever trusted someone completely, handed them every piece of yourself, and watched them choose someone else anyway, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Stay until the end. And if this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Matt. The night Adrian Vale came home smelling like another woman's perfume, Elena was standing in the kitchen holding an ultrasound photo with both hands. She'd spent 3 hours setting everything up. Candles on the dining table, not the expensive ones he bought in bulk for charity galas, but the plain ivory ones she'd picked herself from a shop on Brickell Avenue, the kind that smelled like warm vanilla and didn't try too hard. She'd cooked his mother's recipe for lamb chops, the one she'd spent 2 weeks tracking down in an old handwritten card tucked inside Adrian's desk drawer, back when she still had reasons to go looking through his things with innocent intentions. The ultrasound image, 12 weeks, their baby caught mid-motion, one tiny arm raised like it was already reaching for something. She'd slipped it beneath his water glass where he'd find it the moment he sat down. She'd rehearsed what she would say. Nothing dramatic, just, "I found out last Tuesday. I wanted to tell you in person. We're going to have a baby, Adrian." 7 words. She'd practiced them in the bathroom mirror while getting dressed. He walked in at 9:43. She heard the elevator first, then the sound of his keycard against the lock. A sound she'd come to dread without fully understanding why, the way the body starts bracing for impact before the mind catches up. The door opened. He stepped inside and immediately loosened his tie, not looking at her, already pulling his phone out of his jacket pocket, already somewhere else. "Hey," he said. "Not sorry I'm late. Not something smells incredible. Just, hey." "Hey," Elena said back. She watched him register the candles, the table set for 2, the specific quiet of a room that had been prepared for a moment. Something flickered across his face. Not warmth, not curiosity. Something closer to calculation. A man running an internal cost-benefit analysis in real time. "What's the occasion?" he asked. "Sit down," she said. "I made dinner." "I ate." The words landed flat. He said them without hesitation, without even the decency of manufactured guilt, and something inside Elena went very still. She'd been a pediatric nurse for 9 years. She knew how to stay composed when the thing in front of her was more than she could process. She set that skill between herself and the kitchen counter and breathed through it. "Okay," she said. "Sit with me anyway." He crossed to the refrigerator, poured himself a glass of sparkling water, the expensive kind he had shipped in cases from a company in Vermont, the kind she'd always thought was a ridiculous luxury, until she understood that men like Adrian needed everything around them to signal that they had arrived. He leaned against the counter, phone still in hand, reading something on the screen. "I've got calls in 30 minutes, he said. "Singapore. Can this wait?" "No," Elena said. "It can't." Something in her voice made him look up. She wasn't crying. She almost wished she were. It would have been easier to explain, easier for him to dismiss. Instead, she was standing very straight at the edge of the dining table, hands clasped in front of her, and the ultrasound image was still sitting beneath his water glass, waiting. He walked over, sat down, looked at the glass, then at the small white rectangle of paper beneath it, and the moment his brain processed what he was seeing, Elena watched his face do something complicated, a sequence of emotions that moved too fast for her to catch all of them, like frames of film skipping. He picked it up. He looked at it for a long time. "Elena, 12 weeks, she said. "The doctor said everything looks perfect." The silence stretched. The candles burned. Somewhere in the city below their 42nd floor apartment, Miami continued its indifferent hum. Traffic, music, the distant percussion of a world that had no idea what was happening in this kitchen. Adrian set the ultrasound image down on the table. He didn't set it down carefully. He just released it. let it fall flat against the linen tablecloth like a document he'd finished reviewing. "We should talk about this," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "We should." "Not tonight." He stood. "I have the Singapore call, and then there's a situation with the Morrison contract that I need to handle. Let me get through the week, and we'll sit down and really talk about this, okay?" He was already moving toward the hallway. "Adrian." "Elena, I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm saying give me a few days." She didn't stop him. She stood in the kitchen listening to the sound of the bedroom door close. Not slammed, never slammed. Adrian Vale was too controlled for that. And then the distant murmur of his voice on the phone, professional and composed, already in a different world. She blew out the candles one by one. She scraped the lamb chops into the trash. She picked up the ultrasound image and held it against her chest for a long moment before carrying it to the bedroom she used as her reading room, the small one at the end of the hall that had been, for the past several months, the place where she slept when Adrian came home too late, and she didn't want to lie awake in the dark, waiting for a man who was no longer really coming home to her. She didn't cry that night. She lay in the narrow daybed with her hand on her stomach and stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time Adrian had looked at her the way he'd once looked at her. Not through her, not past her, not at some projection of her he'd built to be convenient, but at her. Just Elena, the woman who had loved him when he was still 29 and sleeping on a pull-out couch in a Coral Gables studio and pitching ideas to investors who didn't return his calls. She couldn't remember. That was the night Elena Marlowe understood that she was already alone. She just hadn't admitted it yet. Adrian Vale had not always been the kind of man who lied easily. There had been a version of him, not so long ago, though it felt like a different century, who told the truth even when it cost him. A version who called his mother every Sunday, who remembered the names of the hospital janitors on Elena's ward and asked after them by name when she mentioned them, who drove 2 hours to a nursery in Homestead because Elena had mentioned once that she'd always wanted a Meyer lemon tree on the balcony. He'd surprised her with it on a Tuesday evening, just because. No occasion, no calculation, just because she'd mentioned it once and he'd been paying attention. That man had built Vale Nexus Technologies from a 12-page business plan and $40,000 borrowed from his uncle in Savannah. He'd coded through nights so long that Elena would find him asleep at his desk with his forehead pressed against the keyboard, drool drying on the space bar, and she'd drape a blanket over his shoulders and kiss the back of his head and think, "This one. I chose right." The IPO had changed things in ways neither of them fully tracked until the damage was already done. It wasn't any single moment. It was more like a slow chemical reaction, the way iron oxidizes, invisible and inevitable, until one day you reach for something solid and it crumbles in your hand. The first year after the IPO, Adrian bought the penthouse on Betrayal. The second year, he hired a stylist, a personal trainer, a publicist named Garrett, who spoke exclusively in metrics and never made eye contact with people he considered beneath his professional interest. The third year, Adrian started missing things. Small things first. A dinner reservation Elena had made for their anniversary, a checkup she'd asked him to come to. Then larger things. Her mother's retirement party, the adoption ceremony for the rescue dog she'd stopped mentioning because she understood he wouldn't come to the shelter with her. She'd given the dog up in the end because Adrian didn't want animals in the apartment and she'd been too tired to argue. She gave up a lot of things without arguing. That was her mistake, she thought now, lying in the dark with their unborn child pressing against the inside of her body. Not the fighting that happened, the fighting that didn't. She'd loved him so deliberately, so carefully, so quietly, always adjusting, always finding the angle that caused the least friction, always telling herself that difficult seasons were temporary and that the man underneath the pressure and the ambition and the carefully tailored suits was still the same man who'd driven 2 hours for a lemon tree, that she'd never once made him feel the weight of what she was carrying. And while she was being patient and careful and endlessly, exhaustingly kind, he had found someone who made him feel like he wasn't carrying anything at all. Elena didn't know Vivian Cross's name yet, not that night, but she knew the shape of the thing. She'd been a nurse long enough to recognize when something was wrong before the test results confirmed it. Her body knew. Her nervous system had been screaming quietly for months. She just hadn't been ready to listen. Maya Collins showed up at the apartment the following Saturday morning with 2 cups of coffee from the place on 8th Street and the specific expression she wore when she already knew things were bad, but was waiting for Elena to say it first. Maya had been Elena's closest friend since their second year of nursing school. The kind of friend who could read a room at 40 paces, who never pushed but always showed up, who had a gift for silence that most people spent their whole lives trying to develop. She set the coffees down on the balcony table and looked at the city and waited. "I told him about the baby," Elena said. "And?" "He said we'd talk about it this week." Elena wrapped both hands around the paper cup. Below them, Miami glittered in the late morning light, all glass and salt air, and the kind of beauty that didn't care what was happening inside the buildings it reflected. "He hasn't brought it up since." Maya was quiet for a moment. "Has he asked how you're feeling?" "No." "Checked in at all? Texted, called?" "Maya." "Okay." Maya nodded once. "Okay. I know what you're going to say. I'm not going to say anything." "You're going to tell me to trust my gut." "Your gut already knows," Maya said. "I'm just here for the coffee part." Elena looked at her hands. There was a small scar on her left index finger from a needle stick incident during her second year of nursing, the kind of invisible mark that only meant something if you knew what had caused it. She had a lot of those. A life built of small wounds that healed clean enough that strangers couldn't see them. "He came home last Tuesday smelling like something," she said. "Not alcohol, not cigarettes, just different. A different woman's scent. Do you know what that smells like? When it's not your perfume, and it's not his cologne, and it's just this third thing that doesn't belong in the equation?" Maya said nothing. "I went through his travel receipts," Elena continued. "He told me the Atlanta trip was a Nexus conference, but I checked the hotel charges on the corporate card statement. I still have access to his billing summaries. He never changed the login after we got married. I think he just forgot. And there were 2 room service orders billed to the suite. 2 desserts, 2 glasses of wine." The city hummed below them. "He might have had a colleague," Maya started. "Côtes du Rhône and crème brûlée," Elena said. "He hates crème brûlée. He's always hated it. He has a thing about the texture, and he only orders Côtes du Rhône when he's trying to impress someone." The silence between them held its breath. "I'm not imagining this," Elena said. It wasn't a question. "No," Maya said quietly. "I don't think you are." Elena nodded. She'd expected the confirmation to hurt more than it did. Instead, it just settled over her, heavy and flat, the way grief settles when you've been bracing for it long enough that the impact itself becomes almost a relief. "I need to know for certain," she said. "Before I do anything, before I say anything to him. I need proof. I need to see it with my own eyes so that when I'm standing in front of him, he can't make me doubt myself." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find someone who can help me get it." Clara Whitmore didn't look like what Elena had imagined when she'd searched for private investigators in Miami. She was 51, compact, with close-cropped silver hair, and the measured eyes of someone who'd spent decades watching people try to hide things they couldn't. She operated out of an office in Wynwood above a tile import company, and she shook Elena's hand across a desk covered in organized stacks of manila folders without any of the performative sympathy Elena had half expected. "Tell me what you know," Clara said. "And be specific. Vague feelings are for therapy. I work with facts." Elena liked her immediately. She laid it out. The receipts, the perfume, the ultrasound, the week of silence afterward. Clara listened without interrupting, making notes in a small spiral-bound pad, with the focused efficiency of someone who had heard variations of this story too many times to be surprised by it, but never too many times to take it seriously. When Elena finished, Clara set down her pen. "Your husband, Adrian Vale, the Vale Nexus guy." "Yes," Clara absorbed this. "High profile, which means this goes sideways. It becomes a story." "I know." "You sure you want to know?" Elena looked at her. "I'm 8 months pregnant, and I've been sleeping in the guest room for 3 months because my husband comes home at midnight, and I can't sleep next to a man I don't recognize anymore. I'm sure I want to know." Clara picked up her pen again. 2-week retainer. I'll have something for you within 10 days. She had something in 6. The photographs arrived in a password-protected digital folder, delivered via encrypted link to the private email address Elena had set up for exactly this purpose. She opened them alone, sitting on the floor of the small reading room with her back against the daybed and her phone on her knees. and she went through each one with the methodical attention she'd learned to apply to the hardest moments. The same way she used to sit with parents in the hospital when she had to deliver news that would change their lives, fully present, not looking away. Adrian and a woman at a rooftop bar in Betrayal, his hand on the small of her back, her head tilted toward him, both of them laughing at something the camera couldn't hear. The woman was striking. Sharp cheekbones, the kind of posture that read as permanent confidence rather than performance, clothes that said money, the way his did. Not flashy, just utterly specific. Elena didn't know who she was yet, but she understood intuitively what she was looking at. A woman who had never once in her life adjusted herself to fit someone else's comfort. More photographs. A parking garage downtown. Adrian and the woman in close conversation, his hand on the roof of her car. The angle of his body turned entirely toward her in a way Elena couldn't remember him turning toward her in years. A hotel lobby. The same woman, Adrian behind her, his hand at the small of her back again. Proprietary, practiced, the gesture of someone who had been making it long enough that it had become unconscious. The last photograph was the worst. Not because it was explicit. It wasn't. It was just the two of them sitting at a table in what looked like a private dining room somewhere. Candles, wine, the kind of restaurant you can't just walk into. And Adrian was looking at her with an expression Elena recognized from a very specific memory. The night he'd proposed, sitting across from her at a plastic table in a taqueria on Calle Ocho, because neither of them had any money and neither of them cared, and he'd looked at her like she was the most precise and necessary thing he'd ever seen in his life. He was looking at this woman the same way. Elena set the phone down on the floor and sat with the photographs for a long time. She didn't cry. She'd cried earlier, in anticipation of this moment, the way the body sometimes releases grief ahead of schedule, like it's trying to get through the worst of it before the actual blow lands. Now she felt something quieter and more frightening. Clarity. All the energy she'd spent wondering, doubting, recalibrating her own perceptions. All of it consolidated into a single, solid fact that sat in her chest like a stone. He knew about the baby. He had held that ultrasound image in his hands, and he had set it down. And he had walked into the bedroom and spent the next 6 days not saying a word about it, and he had gone back to this woman. He had chosen, consciously and repeatedly, to keep choosing her. Elena picked up her phone again. She opened the document she'd started 3 weeks ago, the one labeled simply Notes, nested inside 3 levels of innocuous subfolders, and she began to write, not about her feelings, about facts, about the receipts, the dates, the hotel charges, the pattern she'd identified in his travel schedule, about the conversations she could recall verbatim, the specific lies he'd told her and when, about the corporate card statements she'd saved to a private cloud folder, about everything she knew about the structure of Vale Nexus Technologies, having spent 7 years at Adrian's side while he built it, every board member's name, every major investor's relationship to him, every public statement he'd made about family and integrity and the values that supposedly undergirded his leadership. She wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, she saved the document, set her phone face down on the bed, and lay back with her hands on her stomach. The baby moved, a long, rolling motion, the kind that had started a few weeks ago, unmistakable and strange and wholly itself. Elena pressed her palms flat against her skin and felt it again. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." She wasn't talking to herself. Adrian came home the next evening at a reasonable hour for the first time in weeks, which told Elena that he was feeling guilty about something specific. He always overcorrected when the guilt peaked, showing up with wine he wouldn't drink and questions about her day that he wouldn't fully hear the answers to. He found her in the living room, reading, and he sat across from her with the careful posture of a man who had prepared himself for a conversation. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Fine," she said, without looking up from her book. "The baby is fine." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him trying to find the entry point, the angle that would let him have this conversation on his own terms, which was the only way Adrian Vale knew how to have a conversation. "I've been thinking about what you told me," he said, "about the pregnancy. I know I haven't. I know I've been distant. And I want you to know that I understand this is important, and I'm Where were you on the 15th? Elena said. He stopped. What? March 15th. You told me you were in Atlanta for the Nexus Infrastructure Summit. The pause lasted exactly long enough to confirm everything. I was in Atlanta. The Ritz-Carlton charged 2 glasses of Côtes du Rhône and 2 desserts to your suite, she said. You hate crème brûlée. You've hated it since the second time we ever ate together. You told me it reminded you of your grandmother's nursing home and it made you feel morbid. She still hadn't looked up from her book. Elena, who was with you, Adrian? A colleague, he said, too quickly. One of our corporate partners. We were going over contract language, and it ran late, so we ordered in the room. You're lying, she said. She said it the same way she said everything else. Flat, unornamented, without heat. She felt him flinch across the room. I'm not going to argue with you about it tonight. She closed her book and looked at him for the first time. He looked tired, expensive and tired, like a beautiful machine running on the wrong fuel. Part of her still loved him. She wasn't naive enough to think 7 years of love evaporated in a moment of clarity. But that love felt now like a debt that someone else had already spent. I'm going to ask you once, and I'd like you to tell me the truth, and whatever you say I will deal with, but I need you to tell me the truth. He looked at her. Are you involved with someone else? The silence stretched for 6, 7, 8 seconds. She counted. No, he said. She nodded. Okay. Elena, I said okay. She stood, one hand on her lower back. The baby was sitting high, and her spine had been aching for 2 weeks. I'm going to bed. The lamb chops are in the refrigerator if you're hungry. I labeled the container. She walked past him toward the hall. Elena, his voice broke slightly on the second syllable. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Good night, Adrian, she said, and she kept walking. She hired Clara for a second phase the following morning. Not for more photographs, she had enough. This phase was different. I need to understand his professional exposure, Elena told her. Board relationships, investor agreements, whatever's in the public record about his image and how it's been marketed. Any statements he's made publicly about family, ethics, company culture. Clara studied her. You're building something. I'm preparing, Elena said. There's a difference. Not much of one. Elena met her eyes. He's going to keep lying to me. I can see it on his face. He's made the calculation that he can manage this, that he can keep both things going until he figures out which one he wants. And I'm not going to wait for him to make that decision. I'm not going to sit in that apartment getting larger and more dependent while he decides whether I'm worth keeping. So what are you building? Clara asked again. An exit, Elena said. And if he forces me to use it, a reckoning. Clara nodded slowly, picked up her pen. Tell me what you need. What Elena needed was information, and she gathered it methodically over the next 3 weeks, while Adrian continued performing the architecture of a marriage he'd already gutted. He started coming home earlier, started asking about her prenatal appointments, brought her a book about infant sleep schedules that she recognized as the kind of gesture people make when they're trying to buy time. She accepted the gestures without warmth and without dismissal, giving him nothing that could be read as forgiveness or as accusation, maintaining the careful, neutral surface of a woman who was waiting. She was not just waiting, she was reading the Vale Nexus investor prospectuses from the past 3 years. She was cross-referencing Adrian's public interviews, the ones where he talked about integrity and family and building something that would outlast him, against the timeline of his affair that she'd reconstructed from Clara's reports. She was learning the names of the board members and their particular pressure points. Harriet Ewan, the board chair who had built her entire reputation on ethical corporate leadership and who had specifically cited Adrian's personal brand as central to Nexus's public identity. James Okafor, the major institutional investor who had a morality clause in his investment agreement. She'd found a reference to it in a financial magazine profile from 18 months ago, a detail Adrian would never have flagged because he hadn't believed he'd ever need to worry about it. She was learning what she'd always half known and never fully deployed, that she knew this company as well as anyone outside the executive team. She'd lived beside it for 7 years. She'd listened to 400 dinners worth of strategy, conflict, personnel decisions, market positioning. She'd met every significant investor at least once. She understood the architecture of what Adrian had built because she'd been in the room while he was building it, mostly invisible, mostly useful as a backdrop. The warm, elegant wife who made him look stable and human at the galas and charity events and year-end parties. The invisible woman had been paying attention the whole time. She also found the other thing, not what she was looking for, but what emerged from the patterns she was mapping. 3 payments to a private LLC made from a Nexus corporate account subsidiary, each one substantial, each one routed through a shell structure that didn't quite match the operating expenses reported to the board. She wasn't an accountant, she didn't know exactly what she was looking at, but she knew it was wrong, and she knew it was Adrian's, and she saved every document she could access and forwarded them to a secure folder. Then she called a lawyer. Not the firm Adrian used, obviously. Not anyone in his orbit. She called a woman named Patricia Holm, whose name she'd gotten from a colleague at the hospital, a family law attorney with a reputation for taking cases that other firms found inconvenient and for winning them. Patricia had close-cut auburn hair and a handshake that conveyed exactly how seriously she took the next 60 minutes of her time. She listened to Elena's situation, asked 7 precise questions, and then said, "You have more than enough to file. The question is what outcome you're trying to achieve." "I want to protect my child," Elena said. "Financially, legally. I want whatever he builds from this point forward to be accounted for. I want to know that the life I'm going to provide for this baby doesn't depend on Adrian Vale's goodwill." "That's achievable," Patricia said. "And I want him to understand what he threw away," Elena added. "Not out of revenge. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in consequence. I want him to know, concretely, what his choices cost." Patricia studied her for a moment. "That part's harder to engineer from a legal standpoint." "I know," Elena said. "I'm not asking you to engineer it. I'm handling that myself." Patricia allowed herself a small, dry smile. "All right," she said. "Let's talk strategy." The day Elena chose was a Thursday in late April, 6 weeks before her due date. She'd selected it with care. Adrian was home. No travel scheduled, no late evening calls on his calendar, which she still had access to because he'd added her as a shared viewer 3 years ago when they were trying to coordinate their schedules better, and had never thought to revoke her access. The housekeeper had been in that morning, which meant the apartment was clean and ordered, which mattered to Elena in a way she couldn't entirely explain. Something about having the stage set correctly, about not allowing the most significant moment of her marriage to take place in disorder. She dressed carefully, not provocatively, not dowdily, just herself. Dark jeans, a loose navy top that accommodated her pregnancy with clean lines, her hair down. The woman she was before she'd started shrinking herself to fit the shape of his life. She set the folder on the dining room table, not spread out, not fanned for dramatic effect, just there, closed, centered. Adrian came in from the kitchen and stopped when he saw her standing. "Hey," he said, the same word he'd said the night of the candles and the lamb chops and the ultrasound. "Hey." "Sit down," Elena said. Something in her voice made him sit. She opened the folder and placed the photographs in front of him, one by one. The rooftop bar, the parking garage, the hotel lobby, the private dining room with the candlelight and the expression on his face that she'd spent 3 weeks trying to unsee. She didn't say anything. She just placed them, methodically, in a row. He looked at them. His jaw tightened. His hands, flat on the table, didn't move. "Elena, I'm not going to yell at you," she said. "I'm not going to throw things. I'm not going to cry. At least not right now, not in front of you, because I don't want to give you the satisfaction of believing this is a moment you can manage by comforting me." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down heavily, one hand on her stomach. "I want you to look at those, and I want you to tell me who she is." He looked at the photographs for a long moment. "Her name is Vivian Cross," he said. "She's a corporate strategist. She works with 3 of our major competitors and 2 of our partners." "How long?" 8 months? The number landed like a fist. 8 months. 4 of which Elena had already been pregnant. She just hadn't known it yet when it started. "Did you know I was pregnant when it began?" "No," he said. "I found out about the pregnancy and it didn't stop immediately. I know how that sounds." "How does it sound, Adrian?" He looked up at her. His eyes were wet, which surprised her. Not because she didn't think he was capable of tears, but because she'd half expected him to keep performing control. Instead, he looked like something had given out inside him, like a load-bearing wall that had just understood it was no longer load-bearing. "It sounds like I failed you," he said. She looked at him. This man she had loved for 7 years. This man who had driven 2 hours for a lemon tree. This man who had set an ultrasound image down on the table like a document he'd finished reviewing. "You need to leave," she said. He didn't argue, he didn't plead. He nodded once, slowly, like a man accepting a sentence he'd already known was coming. He pushed back from the table and he stood and he looked at her, really looked at her, in a way he hadn't in longer than she could accurately remember. And whatever he saw seemed to cost him something. "I'll have someone come for my things tomorrow," he said. "The locks will be changed by morning," she said. "Have them call the building manager." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and walked toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "Elena?" His voice was rough, stripped of the professional gloss that usually coated everything he said. "I'm sorry." "I know," she said. The door closed. She sat at the dining table for a while without moving. The photographs were still laid out in a row in front of her. Outside, Miami did what Miami always did. Glittered and hummed and turned in its enormous, indifferent orbit, caring nothing for the specific weight of what had just happened in this particular apartment on this particular Thursday in April. Elena gathered the photographs back into the folder. She picked up her phone. She opened the document she'd been building for 3 weeks. The one with the dates, the receipts, the corporate account irregularities. The quotes from Adrian's public interviews set against the reconstructed timeline of his affair. Her finger hovered over the screen. She thought about Harriet Ewan, the board chair, who had specifically cited Adrian's personal brand as central to Nexus's identity. She thought about James Okafor and the morality clause. She thought about the payments to the LLC that didn't match the reported operating expenses. She thought about the business journalists she'd met at 3 years' worth of galas, the ones who'd handed her cards she'd collected out of politeness and kept in a box in the reading room without ever expecting to use them. Her finger pressed down. She began to type. She didn't send it. Not yet. She wasn't ready to send it yet. There were things to verify, language to consider, Patricia to consult in the morning, but the document was open and growing, and she was no longer the woman standing in a kitchen holding a candle and waiting for a man to come home and notice her. 3 floors below, in the building's underground parking structure, Adrian Vale sat in his car in the dark. He hadn't started the engine. He was holding his phone, and on the screen was a text to Vivian. 3 words typed but not yet sent. And he was staring at those 3 words and beginning to understand, in a way that was still forming, still incomplete, that there was no version of the next chapter of his life that was going to feel the way he'd imagined when he was still safely inside the illusion. He deleted the text. He sat in the dark for a long time. In the apartment above him, Elena Marlowe was still typing. Outside the parking structure, beyond the concrete and the glass and the 42 floors of accumulated ambition, Miami spread itself out beneath a sky that was starting, at the edges, to go the particular color it turned just before the storms came in off the Atlantic, that heavy purple-green that locals knew and visitors mistook for beauty. It wasn't beauty, it was pressure. It was the sky gathering everything it had before the break. And in the morning, when the first journalist received an email from an anonymous address containing a detailed timeline, a folder of financial documents, and a set of questions that no PR team on Earth was going to be able to manage cleanly, the storm was going to arrive. The email went out at 6:14 in the morning. Elena had been awake since 4, sitting at the small desk in the reading room with her laptop open and Patricia Holmes' voice in her memory. Be specific, be factual, let the document speak. And she'd gone through the message 11 times before she sent it. Not 11 as hyperbole, literally 11. She'd printed it out, read it on paper with a pen in her hand the way she'd been trained to read medication orders in her first year of nursing, looking for errors that screens made invisible. The message was 3 paragraphs long. It named no names directly. It asked questions. It included, as attachments, 4 documents, 3 corporate account statements showing the payments to the LLC, and a chronological timeline of Adrian's public statements about ethical leadership cross-referenced with the dates established in Claire's investigative reports. She sent it to two people, a financial journalist named Dan Rice at the Miami Herald, who had covered Vale Nexus's IPO and had handed her his card at the Celebration Gala 3 years ago, and a woman named Sue Jin Park at a national business publication who had profiled Adrian twice and who Elena had noticed, at both events, asked sharper questions than anyone else in the room. She did not sign it with her name. She signed it, a source with direct access to Vale Nexus financial records. Then she closed the laptop, went to the kitchen, made herself a cup of decaf, and sat at the table watching the sun come up over Biscayne Bay. Her phone rang at 9:02 a.m. Dan Rice. She let it go to voicemail. He called again at 9:17. She let that go too. She wasn't ready to talk yet. She needed the information out in the world first, needed it to have a life independent of her before she became a voice attached to it. Patricia had advised her on this. Release the documents, then let them work, then decide what you want to say and when. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly Adrian would hear about it. His number appeared on her screen at 9:44 a.m. She stared at it for 5 full rings, then picked up. "What did you do?" he said. Not a question. A sentence spoken in a register she'd never heard from him before. Not anger, not the controlled professional authority he deployed like a weapon. Something raw, something frightened. "Good morning, Adrian." "Elena." She could hear him moving, a door closing, the specific acoustics of a room going from open to enclosed. "I have 3 calls from Garrett this morning and a message from Harriet Ewan asking me to call her before 9:30, which I missed because I was—" He stopped, breathed. "Did you contact the media?" "I sent some information to some journalists," she said. "Financial journalists, the kind who cover corporate governance." "That is my company." His voice cracked on the last word just slightly. "You went after my company." "I went after the truth," she said, "which is a thing you had several opportunities to volunteer on your own. Do you have any idea what this could—" He cut himself off. She heard him breathing through his nose the way he did when he was trying to manage a reaction that wanted to be much larger than the container he was holding it in. "There are investors, there are employees, there are people whose livelihoods depend on Nexus not being the subject of a financial scandal, Elena. Real people, not just me." "I know," she said. "I thought about that." "Then why—" "Because you sat across from me at that table and you lied to my face while I was 8 months pregnant with your child," she said. Quietly. No heat. "And you'd been lying for 8 months before that. And I decided I was done absorbing the consequences of your choices while you experienced none of your own." The silence on the line was dense and specific. "The LLC payments," he said finally. "How did you get those?" "You never changed the billing access on the corporate account summaries." Another silence. "Are you going to talk to them?" he asked. "The journalists?" "I haven't decided." "Elena," he exhaled. "I need you to— I'm asking you, please, not to do anything else until we can sit down and talk. As people who still have to co-parent a child together, whatever's between us personally, what you do next affects more than just me." She considered this. Not because it moved her. The appeal to co-parenting solidarity, deployed strategically, was something she'd been expecting. But because she was genuinely thinking about what she wanted, and what she wanted was not to burn his company to the ground. She wasn't made that way. She didn't want scorched earth. She wanted him to feel the floor drop out from under him, the way it had dropped out from under her when she was standing in a kitchen with a candle and an ultrasound photo, and a man who could not look at her. "I'll call Patricia," she said. "If she agrees a meeting is appropriate, I'll let you know." "Patricia." He stopped. "You hired an attorney. Did you think I was going to handle this alone?" The silence this time had a different quality, something shifting in it. The sound of a man recalibrating a situation he'd fundamentally miscalculated. "I'll call you this afternoon," he said. "Don't," she said. "I'll be in touch when I'm ready." She hung up. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that with something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite surprise, just acknowledgement. She was 8 months pregnant and she had just sent documents to 2 financial journalists and told her husband's lawyer to wait and hung up the phone. On a man whose first instinct in a crisis was to command the room back into order. Her hands were not shaking. She finished her decaf and went to take a shower. Vivian Cross found out about the email through Garrett, which was itself a piece of information, that Adrian's publicist had reached out to her directly, meaning she was already embedded in his crisis management apparatus in a way that hadn't been explicitly defined. She was in her downtown office when the call came, sitting across from a client whose media strategy she was reconstructing after a moderately catastrophic earnings miss, and she excused herself with the smooth efficiency she applied to all disruptions and stepped into the glass-walled corridor that overlooked the building's atrium. "How bad?" she said, before Garrett could deliver a preamble. "The financial stuff is manageable if we move fast," Garrett said. He always talked like he was reading from a script he'd written while running. "The LLC payments have an explanation that'll hold under scrutiny if we get ahead of it. What I'm more concerned about is the source. Whoever sent this knows the internal account structure. That's not a hacker. That's someone with access." Vivian already knew who it was. She'd known the moment Garrett said source with direct access. "Is he handling it?" she asked. "He's trying. He's got a call with Harriet at 2. But Sujin Park is already asking questions, and you know her, she's not going to stop at the financial angle." Vivian looked through the glass at the atrium below, at the geometry of people moving across polished floors without knowing any of this was happening above them. She had a particular way of processing pressure, not by feeling it less, but by converting it immediately into tactical problems with solvable components. It was one of the things that made her exceptional at what she did, and she was beginning to understand one of the things that made her genuinely terrible at being in the kind of situation she currently found herself in. She had known about Elena. She had known from the beginning Adrian hadn't lied to her about being married, which was one of the things she told herself when the less comfortable thought surfaced. She'd made her own calculation that a man in Adrian's particular phase of success and restlessness was operating on borrowed time in his marriage regardless, that she hadn't created the distance in that relationship, she'd simply occupied the space it created. She believed this when it was convenient. She believed it less at 2 a.m. when she was lying in her apartment thinking about the fact that somewhere across the city, Adrian's pregnant wife was sleeping. "Tell him I'm available if he needs to talk strategy," she said. "He might need more than strategy," Garrett said. "He might need to make some decisions about what the public picture looks like going forward." Vivian understood what public picture meant. She'd been in this industry long enough to know that crisis communications, at its most fundamental, was about controlling the narrative, and the narrative currently had 2 women in it and a pregnant wife and a set of financial irregularities. And the cleanest version of that narrative, the one that let Vale Nexus survive with minimum damage, had only 1 woman in it, and it wasn't her. "I'll talk to him," she said. "Soon," Garrett said. "Harriet Ewan is not a patient woman." Vivian went back into her meeting and finished her client's strategy session with the professional completeness that she applied to everything, and when the client left, she sat alone in her office for a few minutes and let herself feel the shape of the situation fully. She had been certain, some months ago, that this was building towards something permanent, not because Adrian had explicitly said so, but because of the way he'd started making space for her, rearranging trips, calling at times that weren't expedient but were chosen, the way a man does when he's stopped thinking about someone as a compartment and started thinking about them as a center. She'd let herself believe in that reading because she wanted to, which was, she recognized now, the least strategically sound decision she'd made in years. She picked up her phone and called him. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was alone. "I talked to Garrett," she said. "I know." His voice was flat and tight. "I'm dealing with it." "You need to decide what you're telling Harriet." "I know what I'm telling Harriet." "Adrian," she kept her voice level. This was terrain she knew. Professional crisis, decision trees, consequence mapping. She was more comfortable here than anywhere else. If the financial questions get attached to the personal story, you lose the ability to separate them. Right now, they're 2 parallel tracks. You need them to stay parallel. "The financial questions have an explanation," he said. "The payments to the LLC were for a consulting contract that wasn't logged correctly because Marcus's team used the wrong budget code. It's a documentation error, not a fraud. Can you prove that quickly?" "Marcus is pulling the contract right now." Okay, then the financial track is manageable. The personal track is what's going to define the story. She paused. Garrett said Sujin Park is already on it. Yeah. She's going to want to know about me. The pause was long enough that Vivian could hear him breathing. We'll figure it out, he said. Adrian. She said his name with a precision that was designed to cut through performance. I need you to tell me what we're doing, not what we're managing, what we're doing. Another pause. I don't know yet, he said. She absorbed this. Okay, she said. Call me after Harriet. She hung up and looked out her window at the city and thought about the word yet. In her professional vocabulary, yet meant the decision had already been made, and the person was still working up the nerve to say it. She had heard it too many times to mistake it for uncertainty. The meeting with Harriet Ewan happened in a conference room on the 44th floor of the building where Nexus kept its Miami executive offices. And Adrian arrived 7 minutes early, which was something he never did because arriving early ceded psychological ground. But today he needed the room first, needed to be standing when Harriet walked in. Harriet Ewan was 63, Taiwanese American, with reading glasses she wore on a chain and the specific professional stillness of someone who had spent 4 decades in rooms where men underestimated her and had made her career partly from the systematic exploitation of that era. She had been chairman of the Nexus board for 4 years, and she had championed Adrian's leadership publicly and invested significant reputational capital in the proposition that Vale Nexus was a company whose values were inseparable from its founder's character. She walked in with a single folder, closed, and sat down without preliminaries. Tell me about the LLC, she said. Documentation error, Adrian said. Wrong budget code. Marcus is pulling the original contract and it'll be on your desk by end of day. Harriet nodded once. That's the easy part, she said. What about the rest? The affair. He didn't dress it up. He decided on the drive over that Harriet would respect directness and punish evasion, which meant he needed to come in with the worst version of the truth already acknowledged. I've been in a relationship outside my marriage. It's over. My wife has filed for divorce proceedings. He didn't know this last part for certain yet, but Patricia Holmes' involvement made it functionally inevitable. Harriet looked at him over the reading glasses she'd settled on her nose. How long? 8 months. And your wife is 8 months pregnant, yes. The room held that information for a moment. Sujin Park is going to publish something, Harriet said. The question is what shape it takes when it comes out. I know. The morality clause in Okafor's investment agreement is broadly written, she said. His legal team is going to look at this. I know that too. Harriet folded her hands on top of the closed folder. Adrian, I've sat in this chair for 4 years and I've watched you build something genuinely significant. The cybersecurity division alone has 3 government contracts that matter for national infrastructure. I'm not interested in destroying that because you made decisions in your personal life that were... She paused and chose her next word with visible care. Consequential. Neither am I, he said. Then you need to understand that the board's position, as of this morning, is that we need distance between your personal situation and the public face of the company, which means controlled narrative, coordinated with Garrett, and your immediate public focus on operational stability. I understand. And you need to understand, Harriet continued, her voice not changing register at all, that if this gets messier, if your wife continues to communicate with journalists, if the personal story becomes the financial story, the board will have to consider whether your continued presence in the leadership position is serving the company's interests. Adrian looked at her. You're talking about removing me. I'm talking about options the board hasn't taken off the table, she said, which is different, and I'm telling you now so you're not surprised later. He nodded. I appreciate that. Don't appreciate it, she said. Fix it. She stood, picked up her folder, and left without the social ritual of a closing pleasantry, which was how Adrian knew the conversation had gone about as well as it possibly could have, which was not well at all. He sat in the conference room alone for a few minutes after she left. The city was spread out below him through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the same city, the same permanent glitter, seen from a different altitude than the one he was used to. He was still in the building, still in the chair. But Harriet had just told him, in language precise enough that it couldn't be misread, that the chair was no longer guaranteed. He thought about Elena sitting in the reading room at 6 in the morning, He thought about how long she'd been awake before she hit send. He thought about the fact that she'd had access to those account statements for years and had never used them, had never even mentioned them, until the moment he'd given her no other choice. His phone buzzed, a text from Vivian. How did it go? He looked at the text for a long time. Then he put the phone face down on the conference table and stared at the glass and the city and the specific quality of morning light over the water that he'd always thought of when he was in this room, as proof that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He didn't feel that now. He felt like a man standing in a structure he'd built with his own hands, watching the load-bearing elements assess whether to hold. He picked up the phone and typed, "We need to talk tonight. In person." Vivian's response came in under a minute. "I know." The Sujin Park story went live at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday. It was not the story Adrian had hoped for and not quite the story Elena had designed, because a good journalist is not a weapon, she is a narrator, and Sujin's version was more complex and more damaging than either of them had separately planned. The financial irregularities led the piece, framed correctly as a documentation error currently under review, a concession to accuracy that Garrett had successfully negotiated. But the second half of the article turned on a quote from a source described as close to Vale's personal life, who characterized the period of the alleged irregularities as coinciding with a period of significant personal upheaval, including a marital breakdown. The phrase marital breakdown appeared in the fourth paragraph. By 6 p.m., it had been picked up by 3 financial news aggregators and 2 national outlets. By 7 p.m., Nexus stock was down 4% in after-hours trading. Adrian saw the number on his phone while he was standing outside Vivian's building, in the specific way that a person sees information they've been dreading. Not with shock, but with the hollow recognition of a thing that has finally arrived. He went inside. Vivian's apartment was the kind of space that expressed her with total accuracy. High ceilings, clean lines, everything chosen and nothing accumulated. A place that looked curated rather than lived in, which Adrian had found glamorous 8 months ago and now found, standing in the entrance with his 4% down stock price visible on his phone screen, slightly airless. She poured 2 glasses of wine he wasn't going to drink and set them on the table and sat down and looked at him with the specific expression she deployed when she'd already run the analysis and was waiting for him to catch up. "Say it," he said. "You already know what I'm going to say. Say it anyway." She held his gaze. "The cleanest version of the next 6 months for Vale Nexus has you and Elena presenting a united front. Not reconciled necessarily, but civil, co-parenting, collaborative. The story becomes difficult personal situation, handled maturely, company leadership stable. That narrative requires me to be invisible." "Vivian, I'm not saying it as a complaint," she said. "I'm saying it as a fact. You know it's true. Garrett knows it's true. Harriet Ewan almost certainly told you something close to it this afternoon." He sat down across from her. "This isn't just a PR problem." "I know that. What do you want from this? From me? Right now?" She was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for her. Vivian Cross had an answer for everything. The pauses in her speech were generally tactical, not genuine. This one felt different. "I want you to tell me honestly," she said, "whether you came here tonight because you want to be here or because you don't know where else to go." The question landed harder than he was prepared for. He looked at her across the wine glasses and the clean lines and the carefully curated space, and he thought about Elena on the floor of the reading room, and the baby that was 6 weeks from existing in the world, and the woman across from him who was brilliant and electric and who had made him feel for 8 months like someone who had escaped the weight of his own life. He thought about what escape actually was. Not freedom, just postponement. "I don't know," he said. Something shifted in her face. Not collapse. Vivian Cross did not collapse, but a readjustment. A woman recalibrating from a position she'd held longer than was strategically sound. "Then I think," she said carefully, "that you should probably figure that out before you make any more decisions that affect other people." He stood up. He left the wine untouched. He stood in the entrance of her apartment for a moment with his hand on the doorframe and looked back at her. This woman he'd wanted so completely for 8 months. This woman who had seemed like an answer to a question he'd been too successful and too cowardly to actually articulate, And what he felt was not love and not guilt, but something more complicated than either. He was on the elevator down when his phone rang. The number on the screen was the hospital. His stomach dropped before his brain had finished processing the information. A full-body animal response that bypassed every layer of professional conditioning he'd spent 20 years building. He picked up. "Mr. Vale?" A calm voice, clinical, the specific register of someone trained to deliver information without amplifying panic. "This is the nursing desk at Brickell Medical Center. Your wife was brought in this evening by her friend Maya Collins. She's stable. I want to be clear about that first. But she went into early labor and we need to make you aware that there are some complications we're monitoring. She's asked us to contact you." He was already moving toward the lobby door. "I'm on my way," he said. He hit the street at a near run, phone to his ear, waving for a cab with the other hand, and the city came at him. Noise and light and the salt-thick air off the bay. And for the first time in 8 months, Adrian Vale was not thinking about Vivian or the stock price or Harriet Ewan or Sujin Park's article or the 4% or any of it. He was thinking about Elena on a hospital bed 6 weeks too early, and the ultrasound image he'd set down on the table like a document he'd finished reviewing, and the word complications sitting in his chest like a stone that kept getting heavier with every step. He got in the cab. "Brickell Medical," he said. "Fast." The driver pulled into traffic, and Adrian sat in the back seat in the dark with his hands flat on his thighs, and he understood with the slow, devastating clarity of a man arriving too late to a fire he himself had started, that some consequences did not wait for you to be ready. The cab ride took 11 minutes. Adrian counted them without meaning to, the way the mind latches onto measurable things when the unmeasurable ones are too large to hold. 11 minutes through Thursday evening traffic, the driver cutting down Brickell Avenue with the specific aggression of someone who'd been told fast and took the instructions seriously, and Adrian sat in the back with his phone in his hand and did not call anyone because there was no one to call who would make the next 11 minutes shorter. He called Elena's number anyway. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording, calm, professional, the voice she used for the world outside their apartment, hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. He hung up without leaving a message. The hospital entrance was lit the way hospitals always were. That specific fluorescent certainty that existed independent of the time of day, and Adrian went through the automatic doors and to the desk and gave his name and was directed to the 4th-floor maternity wing with the efficient neutrality of a system that had seen every version of this particular arrival and had learned to treat urgency as routine. Maya was in the waiting area outside the maternity ward. She was sitting very straight in a plastic chair with a paper cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. And when she saw Adrian come through the door, something crossed her face. Not warmth, not hostility, just a careful settling, the expression of a woman who had prepared herself for this specific moment and was executing the preparation. She stood. "How is she?" Adrian said. "Stable," Maya said. "The baby is stable. They've got her on medication to slow the contractions. The doctor said if they can hold it another few hours, the risk profile improves significantly." "What caused it?" Maya looked at him with an expression that was not unkind but was absolutely clear. "Stress," she said. "That's what the doctor said. Sustained elevated stress in the 3rd trimester can trigger early labor." He absorbed this. He had been braced for it, had known, on some level, from the moment the hospital called, but knowing something intellectually and having it stated plainly by another person were 2 entirely different physical experiences. "Can I see her?" "She asked for you," Maya said. "That's why they called. But I need you to understand something before you go in there." Maya, 1 minute, she said. Not loudly, with the authority of someone who had earned the right to 1 minute. "Elena is going to be the calmest person in that room, because that is what she does. It is how she is built. She will be calm for the baby, and she will be calm for the nurses, and she will probably be calm for you. And that composure is going to cost her something. So I need you to go in there and not make it cost her more than it already does. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. Maya looked at him for a moment, assessing. Then she stepped aside. The room was quieter than he'd expected. A monitor beside the bed tracked 2 heartbeats, Elena's and the baby's, in parallel lines that moved with the patient reliability of something that could not afford to do otherwise. Elena was reclined against the raised head of the bed, an IV line in her left arm, wearing a hospital gown that made her look younger and more exposed than he'd seen her in years. Her hair was loose and there were shadows under her eyes that told him she'd been awake before this happened, had probably been awake most of the night, which he already knew because he'd been the reason. She looked at him when he came in. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had been expecting him and had already decided, in the time since she'd asked the nurses to call, exactly what this interaction was going to be. "Hey," she said. He crossed to the chair beside the bed and sat down. "How are you feeling?" Like someone turned up the volume on everything by about 40%. She shifted slightly, adjusting the monitor lead on her belly. "The contraction slowed down about an hour ago. They think we're okay." "We," he said. She looked at him. "Me and the baby," she clarified. "Not cruelly, just accurately." "Right." He put his hands on his knees. "I'm sorry, Elena." "I know." "No. I mean, about tonight. About all of it. About the specific sequence of events that led to you being in this room right now. That's—" He stopped. He'd prepared something in the cab, a series of sentences he'd assembled with care, and they all sounded, now that he was in this room with the monitors and the 2 heartbeats, and her face, like exactly what they were, prepared. "I don't have language for how sorry I am." "You don't need language," she said. "I need you to sit there and be quiet and let me rest, and I need the baby to stay put for another 6 weeks. That's what I need right now." He nodded. He sat back. He looked at the monitors. For 45 minutes, he sat in the chair beside her bed while she drifted in and out of a light sleep, and the machines tracked their 2 heartbeats with the same dispassionate patience. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He sat and watched and let the specific weight of what he'd built and what he'd broken settle over him in the particular way that only hospitals could make you feel. The way the controlled environment stripped away every layer of performance and left you with just the bare fact of a body, and what it was doing and whether it was going to be okay. Around midnight, Elena opened her eyes and looked at him. "You should go," she said. "I'm going to sleep now and Maya's coming back and you should get some rest." "I can stay." "Adrian." She said his name with a patience that held no warmth and no bitterness, just the specific exhaustion of a woman who had been managing him in one form or another for 7 years. "Go." He stood. He looked at her for a moment. This woman, this life he'd gutted. And then he looked at her stomach, at the visible evidence of the thing he'd set down on a table like a document he'd finished reviewing, and something in his chest performed an action that he didn't have a clean word for. Not remorse. More than remorse. The sensation of understanding the full structural load of a mistake only after the structure had failed. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. She was already closing her eyes. He left. In the corridor, Maya was waiting with her arms crossed, and the particular set of her jaw that meant she had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. "She's going to be fine," she said. "Both of them." "I know." He buttoned his jacket. His hands were working slightly below their usual precision. "Thank you for being here." Maya looked at him. "You know what kills me," she said. Not with heat, just with the weariness of someone who'd been carrying information for a long time. She never stopped believing you were still in there, even after she knew, even after the photographs and the receipts and everything. Some part of her kept waiting for the version of you that drove 2 hours for a lemon tree to show back up. He didn't say anything. "Don't tell her I told you that," Maya said. "She'd be furious." "I won't." Maya looked at him for another moment, then sat back down in the plastic chair and picked up her paper cup of coffee. Conversation over. Adrian walked to the elevator, pressed the button, stood in the corridor with the fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic and the sound of his own breathing. His phone buzzed. A text from Vivian. "Is she okay?" He stared at it. He typed, "Yes, go to sleep." And then he deleted it without sending, because he didn't know what the right response was and he was too tired to figure it out, and because something about the text, Its brevity, its assumption of access, the fact that Vivian's first message after he'd left her apartment was about Elena and not about them, felt like a small test he couldn't identify the answer to. He pocketed the phone unanswered and stepped into the elevator. What Adrian did not know, as the elevator descended, was that the night was not finished with him. He did not know that 40 minutes earlier, while he was sitting in the chair beside Elena's bed listening to the monitors, a man named Scott Teller had walked into the lobby of his building downtown and asked the front desk to call Adrian Vale's office with a message. Scott Teller was 54, a former financial auditor who had spent 12 years at a federal agency before leaving under circumstances that were described publicly as a retirement and were described by people who knew the actual story as something considerably more complicated. He had a face that looked like it had been set in its current expression for a very long time and never found reason to change. Adrian didn't know Scott Teller. He had never met Scott Teller. But Scott Teller knew Marcus Webb, Adrian's CFO, the man who was currently pulling the original contract for the LLC payments, to demonstrate to Harriet Ewan that the financial irregularities were a documentation error. And what Scott Teller knew about Marcus Webb was the thing that was going to make the next 72 hours the worst of Adrian Vale's professional life. Adrian found out about it at 7 in the morning. He'd slept 4 hours on the couch in what had been, until 4 days ago, his apartment, because he still had a key and he didn't have anywhere else to go, and he was too depleted to arrange alternatives. He woke to 6 missed calls from Garrett and a text from an unknown number that contained only a name, Scott Teller, and a number to call back. He called Garrett first. "There's a problem," Garrett said. "That is not the problem we thought we were managing." Adrian sat up on the couch. "Tell me." "The LLC, the payments. Marcus said it was a budget code error on a consulting contract." "I know. He said he'd have documentation by end of day." "He doesn't have documentation," Garrett said, "because there is no consulting contract." The room was very quiet. "Say that again," Adrian said. "There is no contract. Marcus made the payments himself, authorized under his CFO discretionary budget, and routed them to an LLC he controls through a nominee." Garrett's voice was stripped of its usual velocity, which was how Adrian knew this was as bad as it sounded. "He's been doing it for 14 months, 3 payments, combined total of $840,000. Adrian stood up from the couch. He walked to the window. Below, Miami was conducting its morning with complete indifference to the conversation happening 14 stories above it. "Marcus," he said. The name came out flat and wrong, like a word in a language he was hearing for the first time. "There's more," Garrett said. "How can there be more?" "Scott Teller, former federal financial crimes investigator. He walked into your building last night. He's been building a case for the past 6 weeks. He contacted Marcus directly 2 days ago. Apparently gave him a window to self-report before the investigation goes formal. Marcus didn't self-report. Teller is moving forward." The window framed the city and the bay, and the light on the water that Adrian had, for years, read as evidence of arrival. He pressed one hand flat against the glass and felt the cold of it. "Does the board know?" he said. "Harriet Ewan is going to know in approximately 2 hours when Teller's office sends the formal notification to Nexus's general counsel." "Does Elena know?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. Her email to the journalist, the financial documents she attached. She had the account statements. She flagged the payments. She didn't know what she was looking at, I don't think, but she is the reason Soojin Park started pulling the thread, and Soojin Park is apparently who Teller reached out to as his secondary source. The weight of this settled over Adrian in layers. Elena had not set out to expose a fraud. She had set out to expose an affair, and in doing so had inadvertently pulled a thread that connected to something far larger and far darker. A betrayal not by him, but by the man he'd trusted most inside the company. The man he'd promoted 3 years ago over 2 more experienced candidates because Marcus Webb had been his friend since graduate school, and Adrian had believed, without ever really examining the belief, that friendship and loyalty were the same thing. They were not the same thing. They had never been the same thing. "Where's Marcus?" Adrian said. "At home. I don't know if he knows you know yet." "Get me his address," Adrian said. "I'm going there now." Adrian, the lawyers should address Garrett. A pause. Then Garrett read it out and Adrian was already moving toward the door. Marcus Webb lived in Coral Gables in a house that was tasteful without being ostentatious. The kind of house that said comfortable and competent rather than successful, which had always seemed appropriate for a CFO and now seemed like evidence of a performance so sustained that even the house was part of it. Adrian drove his own car, badly. He ran a yellow light turning red, took a corner too fast, parked crooked in front of the house with the front tire against the curb. He knocked. Then he used his fist. Then he rang the bell. Marcus opened the door in a dress shirt and slacks, already dressed for an office day, and the moment he saw Adrian's face, he went very still. He was 50, broad-shouldered, had the kind of face that expressed calmness as a default, and had always seemed to Adrian like a quality, like steadiness, and now read as something else entirely. "You should come inside," Marcus said. "I'm fine here," Adrian said. Marcus looked at the street. Empty, early, a sprinkler running on the neighbor's lawn. "Come inside, Adrian." He stepped back. Adrian walked in. The kitchen. Marcus's wife was not home. Adrian could feel the absence of another person in the house the way you feel it when a room's been aired out. Marcus put the kitchen island between them, which was either instinct or calculation, and Adrian stopped on his side of it and looked at the man he'd known for 22 years. "Tell me it's not what Garrett said," Adrian said. Marcus put both hands on the island. His face was doing something complicated. Not guilty, exactly. Something more exhausted than guilt. Something that looked like a man who'd been carrying a weight so long that being seen with it was almost a relief. "I can't tell you that," he said. $840,000, Marcus." "Yes." 14 months. "Yes." "Through an LLC you control." "Yes." Adrian had rehearsed things on the drive. Sentences, questions, the specific confrontation he'd been building in his head since Garrett's voice stripped its velocity. None of it came. He stood in Marcus Webb's kitchen and looked at his oldest professional friend and felt the floor perform the same dropping sensation it had performed every time in the past 72 hours that reality had revealed a new layer of itself. "Why?" he said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the island. "My daughter," he said. "Chloe. I know Chloe." "She's been sick," Marcus said, "since last year. A condition that the insurance covered most of it. Most. The experimental treatment she needs, the one that's actually working, is not covered. It's $70,000 a session, and she needs it every 6 weeks. And I have been—" He stopped. Something moved across his face that looked like a man who had rehearsed this explanation many times and was now discovering that rehearsal and delivery were not the same. "I tried to ask. I tried to find a way to structure it as a loan or a bonus, or I couldn't find an avenue that didn't require disclosures I couldn't make without explaining why. And I couldn't explain why because Chloe doesn't know how serious it is, and I didn't want—" He stopped again. "I know that's not an excuse." "No," Adrian said. "It's not." "I was going to replace it," Marcus said. "That was always the plan. Once the treatment cycle finished, I was going to find a way to make it right before anyone—" "The investigator's name is Scott Teller," Adrian said. "He went to the board this morning. You had a window to self-report and you didn't take it." Marcus closed his eyes. "You let me stand in front of Harriet Ewan yesterday," Adrian said, "and tell her the LLC payments were a documentation error, and you were sitting in your office knowing you let me—" "I know." "I defended it," Adrian said. "I told the board chair it was a budget code mistake because that is what you told me, and I believed you because I have trusted you with everything for 22 years, and you—" He stopped. The sentence didn't have anywhere left to go that wasn't just volume. Marcus opened his eyes. They were wet. "I'm sorry, Adrian." "Sorry." Adrian laughed, a short, airless sound that had nothing to do with humor. "My marriage is destroyed. My company is in a reputation crisis, and now my CFO has been stealing from me for over a year, and the Federal Financial Crimes Division is notifying the board this morning." He put both hands on the island, mirroring Marcus's position, leaning in. "What exactly are you sorry for? Be specific." "All of it. Marcus said. I'm sorry for all of it. You're sorry you got caught. No, Marcus said, and his voice broke on the word in a way that Adrian believed was real and hated himself slightly for believing. I'm sorry I did it this way. I'm sorry I lied to you. I'm not sorry I kept Chloe alive. The room held that. Outside, the sprinkler finished its cycle. The street went quiet. Adrian stood back from the island. He felt something he couldn't name. Not forgiveness, nowhere near that, but something adjacent to the understanding that the world he'd been operating in had contained layers he'd never looked at, betrayals he'd never anticipated, running parallel to his own choices like tracks on the same line moving in opposite directions. He had been lying to Elena. Marcus had been lying to him. Vivian had been making her own calculations throughout. Everyone, apparently, had been managing their private equations while standing in rooms together and calling it trust. Call a lawyer, Adrian said. Don't call the board, don't call Garrett, don't call anyone else first, call a lawyer. Whatever happens next, you need representation. Marcus stared at him. Are you? I'm not protecting you, Adrian said. I'm not covering this. I can't and I won't. The board is going to know everything by noon, and you're going to face whatever that means. He picked up his keys. But you've got a sick daughter and 22 years. Get a lawyer before it moves forward. He walked out. In his car, parked crooked against the curb with the engine off, Adrian sat for a while. The morning had progressed around him. A neighbor walking a dog. A garbage truck moving slowly down the block. The ordinary machinery of a day that had no idea it was taking place during the worst week of Adrian Vale's life. His phone rang. Patricia Holmes' office number. He let it ring. It stopped. Then his phone buzzed with a text. Ms. Marlowe's legal team has filed preliminary divorce proceedings this morning. Please have your attorney contact this office at your earliest convenience. He set the phone on the passenger seat. Preliminary divorce proceedings. Filed this morning, which meant Elena or Patricia had already been moving in this direction before last night, before the hospital, before the article. Had been preparing it quietly and methodically, the way Elena did everything, the way she'd gathered the documents and built the timeline and contacted the journalists without a single wasted motion. He thought about Maya's voice in the hospital corridor. Some part of her kept waiting for the version of you that drove 2 hours for a lemon tree to show back up. He thought about a Tuesday evening 7 years ago, a Meyer lemon tree in the back of his car, Elena's face when she opened the door. He picked up the phone and called Harriet Ewan. She answered on the second ring. I've just finished reading the notification from General Counsel, she said. No preamble. This is not a documentation error. No, he said. It's not. I found out this morning. I went to Marcus directly. And? He confirmed it. All of it. Harriet was quiet for a moment. The board is convening an emergency session at 2 this afternoon. I expect you to be present. I'll be there. Adrian? Her voice shifted, not warmer but more deliberate. I want you to understand that the board's obligation is to the company and its stakeholders. What that means for your position is going to be a decision made at 2 o'clock with the information available at 2 o'clock. I'm not going to tell you in advance what that decision will be. I understand, he said. Do you have legal representation? I'll have someone by noon. Good. The line went quiet for a moment. For whatever it's worth, Harriet said, I don't believe you knew about the financial misconduct. I want that stated clearly before we walk into that room. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, she said. It's just a fact. The board will assess it as a fact. She paused. 2 o'clock. She hung up. Adrian sat in the car and looked at his phone. He had 4 hours before the board meeting. He needed a lawyer. He needed to eat something, probably. He hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon, and his hands had a slight tremor that he recognized as blood sugar and stress combining into something his body was flagging as unsustainable. He needed to call Garrett and give him enough information to manage the communications timeline. He needed probably to call Vivian and have a conversation he had been successfully avoiding since he left her apartment last night. He opened his contacts, scrolled to the name of a corporate attorney he'd worked with on 2 acquisitions. A man named Desmond Park, who had a reputation for being genuinely unflappable and who charged a rate that reflected this accurately. He called. Desmond answered on the 3rd ring, heard the first 90 seconds of the situation, and said, "I'll clear my morning. Come to the office." Adrian started the car. He was pulling onto the street when his phone rang again. A number he didn't recognize, Miami area code. He answered, "Vale." "Mr. Vale." A woman's voice measured with the specific authority of someone who made calls like this regularly. "My name is Agent Renata Flores. I'm with the Financial Crimes Division. I believe you've spoken with my colleague Scott Teller." "Indirectly," he said. "We'd like to sit down with you this week at your convenience," she said. "As part of our investigation into the Vale Nexus financial account activity, we have some questions that will require your direct input." He was on Coral Way now, heading east, the morning light hitting the car from the wrong angle, making him squint. "Am I a subject of this investigation?" "At this point," Flores said, "you are a person of interest." The phrase landed with the specific weight that it was designed to land with. Person of interest, not a suspect. The legal distinction was significant, and he was already thinking about how Desmond would parse it, but not exonerated either. Something suspended between those two states, which was, he was beginning to understand, where he was going to live for the foreseeable future. Suspended between what he'd done and what had been done to him. Between the choices he'd made and the betrayal he hadn't seen coming, in a space where no amount of professional control or accumulated success was going to make the ground feel solid. "Have your attorney contact my office," he said. "Of course," Flores said. We appreciate your cooperation." She hung up. Adrian kept driving. He thought about Elena in that hospital bed, one hand on her stomach, eyes closed, the monitors tracking 2 heartbeats with the patient indifference of machines that had no stake in the outcome but kept their count regardless. He thought about Marcus's face. "I'm not sorry I kept Chloe alive." He thought about himself, who he had been a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, and he tried to identify the specific moment when the version of Adrian Vale that drove 2 hours for a lemon tree had made his last appearance and quietly left the building. He couldn't find it. That was the worst part. Not that it had happened, but that it had happened so gradually, in such small increments, in choices that had each seemed individually manageable, that he could not point to a moment and say, "There, that was the day I became someone I wouldn't have recognized." The building where Desmond Park kept his office appeared ahead of him. Adrian pulled into the parking structure and found a space and turned off the engine. He sat for a moment in the concrete dark. Then he got out of the car and walked toward whatever came next, because there was nothing else left to do, and because the board meeting was at 2, and because somewhere across the city in a hospital room his child was still holding on, and that, above the investigation and the divorce proceedings and the emergency board session and the $840,000, and all of it, was the only fact that felt like something worth organizing the next few hours around. He pushed through the door into the lobby and hit the elevator button and waited, and when the doors opened, he stepped inside and pressed the number for Desmond Park's floor, and the elevator began to rise, and Adrian Vale, who had built an empire and destroyed his marriage, and failed to see what was happening inside his own company, rode upward toward the reckoning that had been assembling itself quietly and without his permission for the better part of a year. Desmond Park had the kind of office that communicated competence without announcing it, dark wood, no unnecessary objects on the desk, a window that looked out over downtown Miami with the neutral authority of a man who had seen the city from this height long enough that it no longer needed to impress him. He listened to Adrian for 22 minutes without interrupting, which was itself a form of professional skill, and when Adrian finished, Desmond set down his pen and looked at him with the measured consideration of someone running calculations the other person couldn't see. "Person of interest is not a charge," Desmond said. "I know that. The distinction matters enormously in how we proceed. The investigation is targeting the LLC payments, which trace to Marcus. Your exposure depends entirely on what they can establish about your knowledge and authorization." "I didn't know," Adrian said. "I believe you," Desmond said. "The question is whether the evidence supports that independently of your testimony, because your testimony alone is insufficient." He picked up his pen again. "Who had authorization access to the discretionary CFO budget?" "Marcus." "Only Marcus by design. The CFO discretionary account was structured to allow rapid deployment for operational needs without requiring board approval under a certain threshold. Marcus argued for that structure 3 years ago, and the board approved it. So the authorization pathway exists and was legitimate. The fraud is in the destination of the funds, not the authorization mechanism itself. Yes, Desmond nodded. That's workable. Not comfortable, but workable. He made a note. The board meeting at 2. I'm coming with you. I was hoping you'd say that. You don't speak unless I indicate it's appropriate. You answer direct questions with direct answers and nothing additional. You do not volunteer context. You do not attempt to manage the room. You do not apply the same instincts you use in a business negotiation because this is not a business negotiation. Desmond looked at him over the desk. This is a room full of people who need to make a decision about an institution they're responsible for, and the best thing you can do is give them clean information and let them make it. That's not how I operate, Adrian said. I know, Desmond said. That's why I'm telling you. Adrian looked at the window. What's my realistic exposure? Be straight with me. Desmond was quiet for a moment. If the investigation establishes that you had no knowledge of the fraud, which I believe it will, given the account structure and the paper trail, your criminal exposure is minimal to non-existent. Your civil exposure depends on how the board chooses to characterize your oversight responsibilities. And your reputational exposure is, he paused, significant, and largely independent of what the investigation finds. Because of the personal story. Because a financial scandal and a very public personal crisis landing simultaneously in the same company under the same name creates a narrative that is very difficult to separate into its accurate components once it's in motion. Adrian absorbed this. So even if I'm cleared, the clearing will be on page 8, Desmond said. The story was on page 1. The board meeting convened at 2:04 p.m. in the Nexus Executive Conference Room, which was a space Adrian had sat in approximately 300 times and had never once entered as anything other than the most powerful person in it. Today, he sat on one side of the long table with Desmond beside him, and the board arranged across from him. 7 people, all of them faces he knew, all of them wearing the specific expression of individuals who had been asked to do something professionally unpleasant and had prepared themselves to do it cleanly. Harriet Ewan sat at the head. She opened without ceremony. The purpose of this session is to address 2 issues: the financial misconduct identified in the CFO discretionary account and the question of executive leadership stability in light of both the financial situation and the ongoing reputational matters. She looked at Adrian. Marcus Webb has been suspended pending the outcome of the federal investigation. His legal counsel has been notified. That action was taken by unanimous board decision this morning. A pause. Adrian, the board would like to hear directly from you. Adrian felt Desmond's hand settle briefly on his forearm. A light touch. A reminder, clean information, nothing additional. I had no knowledge of the payments to the LLC, Adrian said. I authorized the CFO discretionary account structure on Marcus's recommendation 3 years ago. I did not authorize, approve, or have awareness of the specific transactions in question. I discovered the situation this morning through my communications director and went directly to Marcus for confirmation. And Marcus confirmed the transactions, Harriet said. Yes. Without at that point your having spoken to legal counsel. Yes. Harriet looked at Desmond. Mr. Park, is your client prepared to cooperate fully with the federal investigation? Completely and without reservation, Desmond said. James Okafor, sitting 3 seats to Harriet's left, leaned forward. He was 68, Nigerian-American, with a physical stillness that Adrian had always read as wisdom, and today read as something considerably more dangerous, the stillness of a man who had made his decision before walking into the room. Adrian, he said, I'm going to speak directly. Please, Adrian said. My investment agreement with Vale Nexus contains language regarding the ethical conduct and public standing of the founding executive. I had that language drafted specifically, and I've never had to invoke it. I'm going to have my legal team review the current situation against that language, and I want you to know that review is happening so you're not surprised when it does. I understand, Adrian said. What I want to ask you, directly and off the record of this meeting, He glanced at Harriet, who gave a small nod. Is whether you believe you are currently in a position to lead this company with the full attention and stability that this company requires. The room was very quiet. Adrian thought about Elena in the hospital room. He thought about Marcus's kitchen and the smell of coffee that had been brewing when he walked in. He thought about Vivian's apartment and the wine he hadn't drunk and the word yet. He thought about 11 minutes in a cab and the 2 heartbeats on a monitor and the 4% in after-hours trading and Sujin Park's article and the word complications sitting in his chest like something that had not finished arriving. He thought about what the honest answer to James Okafor's question actually was. I don't know, he said. Desmond's hand moved slightly on the table. That is, Adrian continued, the most honest answer I can give you, and I think honesty is the only currency I have left in this room. Okafor looked at him. Something shifted in his expression, not softening, but a recalibration. The look of a man who had expected performance and received something else. Harriet cleared her throat. The board is going to take a 30-minute recess, she said. Adrian, you and Mr. Park are welcome to remain in the building. Adrian stood. He and Desmond walked to a small conference room adjacent to the main room and sat down without speaking. Desmond poured water from the carafe on the table and pushed a glass toward Adrian without comment. Adrian drank it. You went off script, Desmond said. I know. It might have been the right call, Desmond said, which was the closest thing to well done that Adrian suspected Desmond ever produced. The 30 minutes lasted closer to 45. When Harriet appeared in the doorway of the small conference room, her expression was the same as it had been throughout. Composed, deliberate, giving nothing away before she was ready to give it. Come back in, she said. They sat. The board sat. The city sat beyond the glass, uninvested. The board has reached a preliminary determination, Harriet said. Given the active federal investigation and the associated reputational and operational pressures on the company, we are recommending a temporary transition of executive responsibilities. Adrian, we are asking you to step back from the CEO role for a period of no less than 90 days, during which an independent review of the CFO situation and related governance structures will be conducted. The word step back was doing significant work in that sentence. Everyone in the room understood what it was and what it wasn't. This is not a termination, Harriet continued. Your equity position is unaffected. Your seat on the founding board is unaffected. But the operational leadership of the company needs to be, during this period, separate from the individual at the center of an active investigation, regardless of that individual's culpability. Who runs operations? Adrian said. Sandra Reeves will serve as interim CEO. She's been COO for 2 years. She knows the business. The major clients know her. Harriet's voice was even and without apology, which was the right way to deliver this, and they both knew it. We believe this gives the company the best chance of stabilizing the stock, managing the investor relationships, and coming through the investigation in a position to rebuild. Adrian looked at the table, at his hands on the table, at the specific grain of the wood he'd sat across for 4 years. I built this company, he said. You did, Harriet said, and the board believes you can continue to be part of its future. But right now, the most important thing you can do for what you built is step back and let it weather this without you at the front of it. The room waited. Adrian looked up. He looked at Harriet, then at Okafor, then at the 6 other faces arranged across from him. People he'd recruited, people he'd persuaded, people who had bet significant resources on the proposition that Adrian Vale was the right person to be in the room he was currently being asked to leave. Okay, he said. Desmond looked at him. Okay, Adrian said again, and something in his chest performed a release that he didn't have a clean name for. Not defeat, not relief, something between the two that felt like the body acknowledging that a weight had been set down even if the setting down was not voluntary. We'll have the documentation to you by end of day, Harriet said. The meeting ended without ceremony. Adrian and Desmond rode the elevator down in silence and walked out of the building into the afternoon heat, and the city received them with the complete indifference it applied to everything. You handled that correctly, Desmond said. I lost my company, Adrian said, temporarily. And you kept your equity, your board seat, and your credibility with the one board member whose goodwill you most need for what comes after. Desmond adjusted his jacket. This is not the worst outcome. It's not the best either. No, Desmond agreed. It's not. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The sun was doing what the Miami afternoon sun did, pressing down with the specific authority of something that could not be negotiated with. I need to go to the hospital, Adrian said. Go, Desmond said. I'll handle the paperwork. The hospital was different in the afternoon, busier, louder, the waiting areas populated with the full cross-section of a city going about the business of being sick and recovering and waiting. Adrian moved through it with the specific invisibility of a man whose face had been in the news often enough that people occasionally recognized him but couldn't quite place him, which today felt like a mercy. Elena was awake when he came in. Maya was there. Of course, Maya was there. But she stood when Adrian entered and said something quiet to Elena and left without being asked, which was the clearest signal yet that Elena had told her some version of what she wanted this visit to look like. Elena looked better than she had the night before. Still tired, still wired to the monitors, but more present. Her eyes were clearer, and the particular tightness around her mouth that had been there the night before, the body's signature of sustained pain, had eased. You look terrible, she said. Board meeting, he said. How did it go? He sat in the chair. They're transitioning me out of the CEO role. Temporary, pending the federal review, but he stopped. Sandra Reeves is taking over operations. Elena was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it. He could hear it, the genuine regret of a woman who had loved what he'd built even after she stopped being able to love him the way she once had. It's the right call, he said. Probably. The federal review, you're not... I didn't know about the payments. That's going to bear out. He looked at his hands. Marcus had a reason. A bad one, the way reasons usually are. His daughter's sick. Elena absorbed this. Chloe, she said, you know her? I met her twice at company events. She was... Elena looked at the window. How sick. Serious enough that he stole $800,000 to keep her alive. The monitor tracked 2 heartbeats. Outside the window, afternoon clouds were building over the bay. The same heavy purple-green that had been gathering the night Elena sent the emails. The color that locals knew as pressure rather than beauty. Patricia filed the paperwork this morning, Elena said. I assume Desmond called you. Patricia's office called, yes. It's not... She stopped, pressed her lips together. I'm not doing it out of anger, Adrian. I want you to know that. I'm past angry. I've been past angry for a while now, honestly. I know, he said. I need the legal structure in place before this baby arrives. I need to know that she's protected regardless of what happens with the investigation, with the company, with everything. She, Adrian said. Elena looked at him. Something moved across her face. A quick, involuntary expression, there and gone. The doctor told me last week, she said. I was going to tell you. A girl. He was going to have a daughter. He sat with that for a moment. The weight of it, the specific and entirely unexpected weight of that single pronoun, pressed against something in his chest that had been held very tightly for a very long time and gave slightly beneath the pressure. Okay, he said. He didn't trust his voice with anything more than that. Patricia says the divorce process will take time, Elena said. She was watching him carefully, not with cruelty, not with the pleasure of the wound, just with the attention of a woman ensuring that the information she was delivering was actually landing. The asset division, the custody arrangement, it's all going to be slow, but I'm not... She stopped. I don't want to destroy you, Adrian. I want to be clear about that. Whatever I set in motion with the journalists, whatever comes out of the investigation, I didn't set out to destroy you. I set out to stop being invisible. You weren't invisible, he said. I was, she said. You just didn't notice. The monitors kept their count. A nurse came in, checked the readings, made a note, left with the efficient quiet of someone who understood that the room she'd entered was holding something fragile. "I want to be your father," Adrian said. "Whatever happens between you and me, I want to be present for her. I don't want to be the man who shows up twice a month with gifts and leaves before dinner." "Then don't be that man," Elena said, simply. "I'm going to need you to cut." "I'm not going to make it easy," she said. "I'm also not going to make it impossible. What I'm going to do is watch what you actually do, not what you say, what you do." He nodded. "Starting with the fact that you're here right now instead of wherever else you could be," she said. "That counts. I want you to know that counts." They sat in silence for a while. Not comfortable. It wasn't that. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But something with less barbs in it than the silences of the past several months. The silence of two people who had run out of performances and were sitting in what was actually left. His phone buzzed. He looked at it reflexively. A text from Vivian. "I heard about the board meeting. I'm sorry. Call me when you can." Elena saw his face shift. She was watching him. She didn't miss it. "Is that her?" she said. He didn't insult her by denying the relevance of the question. "Yes." "You should deal with that," Elena said. "Whatever that is, deal with it. I don't need details. I just need it not to be happening in the background while you're standing in front of me telling me you want to be present." "I know," he said. "Adrian." She said his name with a weight that was specific to people who had known each other long enough to load a single word with years of context. "I mean it. Deal with it." He pocketed the phone. He stayed another hour. They talked about nothing significant. The hospital food, the view from the window, a story Maya had told her about a patient on the ward where Elena worked who had learned to walk again after 11 months of everyone telling him he wouldn't. Elena told it the way she told everything. Plainly, with the specific observational detail of someone who paid attention to the world as it actually was rather than as it was convenient to describe. When he left, she was drifting towards sleep again, one hand resting on her stomach, the monitors keeping their quiet and relentless count. In the corridor, he called Vivian. She answered on the first ring. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He stood against the hospital corridor wall, a nurse moving past him with a cart, the fluorescent light doing its eternal work above. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "Whatever this is, I need you to know that." The silence on the line was brief. "I know," she said. Her voice was level, not wounded, not surprised. The voice of a woman who had been running the same analysis and had arrived at the same conclusion through a different route. "I think I knew last night." "It wasn't nothing," he said. "I need you to know I didn't—" "Adrian." She stopped him gently. "It's okay. I'm a big girl. I made my own choices." A pause. "Is she okay, the baby?" "They think so. A few more days in monitoring." "Good," Vivian said, and she meant it. He could hear that she meant it, which was one of the complicated things about the situation. That Vivian Cross was not a villain, and Elena Marlowe was not simply a victim, and he himself was not simply a man who had done a bad thing, but a man who had done a bad thing for reasons that were real and insufficient in equal measure. "Take care of yourself," he said. "Always," she said. The line went quiet. He stood in the corridor for a moment, phone at his side, listening to the hospital around him, the cartwheels and the intercom, and the measured sound of a building organized entirely around the proposition that human bodies were worth the effort of keeping alive. He walked out into the late afternoon. Miami was doing what it did at this hour, the light going golden and horizontal, the air thick with salt and impending rain, the city in the suspended moment between the heat of the day and the percussion of the evening. He stood outside the hospital entrance and breathed it in and felt the specific sensation of a man standing on ground that had recently stopped being reliable and had not yet established whether it was going to hold. His phone rang. Agent Flores. "Mr. Vale," she said, "we've moved the timeline up. We'd like to meet tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Given new information from Mr. Webb's initial statement, there are some questions we need to get on record quickly." "New information," Adrian said. What new information? A pause that was 1 second too long. We'd prefer to discuss it in person. Agent Flores, he kept his voice even. If this meeting is something I need to prepare for differently than a standard cooperation session, I need to know that now. Another pause. Mr. Vale, Marcus Webb has provided a statement that includes claims about your knowledge of the account structure and its intended use. We consider his claims unsubstantiated at this time and inconsistent with the documentary evidence. However, we are required to pursue every line of inquiry. The words landed with the specific impact of something arriving from a direction he hadn't protected. Marcus, who had sat across the kitchen island from him that morning with wet eyes and a story about his daughter's illness and the word sorry, who had let Adrian walk into a board meeting and repeat a lie on his behalf, who had now, apparently, facing the full weight of a federal investigation and the end of his career, given a statement that included Adrian's name in a configuration that was going to require tomorrow morning to untangle. "I'll be there," Adrian said, "with my attorney." "Of course," Flores said. He stood on the sidewalk with the phone in his hand and the golden light coming at him from the west, and the hospital at his back, and the investigation ahead of him, and the divorce paperwork in motion, and the board's decision, and the 90 days and all of it, assembled around him like a structure he'd built himself, and was now standing inside of while it decided whether to hold. He thought about what Desmond had said. The clearing will be on page 8. The story was on page 1. He thought about Marcus's face, the exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a weight so long that being seen with it was almost a relief. He thought about Elena's voice. "I don't want to destroy you. I just want to stop being invisible." He thought about tomorrow morning and Agent Flores and the statement Marcus had given and the new information that had moved the timeline up, and he understood with the cold clarity of a man standing in the wreckage of a week that had progressively revealed new floors beneath each floor it had already collapsed through, that the bottom was not yet visible, that he had not yet seen the worst of what his choices and other people's choices made in the space his choices created were going to cost. He put the phone in his pocket. He walked to his car. He sat behind the wheel with the engine off for 3 minutes, hands on his knees, breathing through the specific kind of stillness that a person learns when they've run out of the option of movement and have to simply sit inside whatever is happening to them and not look away. Then he started the engine. He pulled out of the hospital parking structure into the Miami evening, the storm clouds building purple-green over the bay. The city spread before him with its permanent and indifferent beauty, and he drove toward the morning that was going to arrive whether he was ready for it or not, and the room where a federal agent was going to sit across from him with a statement from the man he'd trusted for 22 years and ask him questions he was going to have to answer with the only thing he had left that could still be called an asset. The truth. All of it. Without management, without calculation, without the instinct to control the room, just the truth, plain and costly, and whatever it built or failed to build from there. The first rain hit the windshield as he merged onto the highway. Not a downpour yet, just the advance drops, the sky's signal that what was coming had already been decided, and the only question was how long you stood in it before you stopped trying to find shelter that wasn't there. He turned on the wipers. He drove. The rain came in full overnight. Adrian heard it from the couch in the apartment that had stopped being his home, lying awake with his phone face down on the coffee table, and the city outside the window reduced to blurred light and the sound of water hitting glass. He didn't sleep more than 90 minutes in total. He lay in the dark and listened to the rain and thought about tomorrow, about Agent Flores and the conference table and Marcus's statement and Desmond's instructions. And beneath all of that, running like a second track, the image of Elena's hand resting on her stomach, and the word she and the weight it carried. A daughter. He was going to have a daughter. He got up at 5:30 and made coffee and stood at the window watching the storm work itself out over the bay, the water gray and churned, the buildings across the water reduced to suggestions of themselves. He thought about who he had been at 29, sleeping on a pull-out couch in Coral Gables. And he thought about who he was now, 50 floors higher, technically, and in every other sense considerably lower. And he tried to locate the line between those two versions of himself, the specific geography of the transformation. and found that it was not a line at all, but a slow gradient, imperceptible degree by degree until the destination was unrecognizable from the origin. He showered, he dressed. He drove to Desmond's office at 7, and they went through everything for 90 minutes. What the documentary evidence showed, what Marcus's statement likely contained, the parameters of cooperation, the specific language of every answer Adrian was going to give, and why. Desmond had a yellow legal pad covered in his precise handwriting, and he went through it point by point with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the difference between an acceptable outcome and a catastrophic one was often a single sentence delivered under pressure. "Tell the truth," Desmond said at the end. "Not your version of the truth, not the managed truth, the actual truth, including the parts that are unflattering to you." "The parts that are unflattering to me include a lot," Adrian said. "Then it'll be a thorough session," Desmond said. "Let's go." The Federal Field Office was a building that had been specifically designed to communicate nothing. No warmth, no hostility, just the flat neutrality of an institution that considered all incoming individuals with the same measured suspension of judgment until the evidence indicated otherwise. Agent Flores was waiting for them in a conference room on the 3rd floor, accompanied by a younger agent named Castillo, who had the attentive stillness of someone in the early years of learning when to speak and when to accumulate. Flores was 50, compact, with dark hair pulled back and reading glasses on the table in front of her that she hadn't put on yet. She shook their hands, indicated the chairs, and waited until everyone was settled before she opened the folder in front of her. "Mr. Vale," she said, "thank you for coming in on short notice." "Of course." "I want to begin by being transparent about the nature of this session. You are here as a cooperative witness. Mr. Webb's statement raised questions we are obligated to pursue, but I want to be clear that the documentary evidence recovered to date is consistent with your account that you had no knowledge of or authorization for the fraudulent transfers." She looked at him over the reading glasses she'd now put on. "What we need from you today is a complete account of the CFO discretionary account structure, your professional relationship with Marcus Webb, and any conversations you can recall that may be relevant to establishing the timeline of his actions." "I understand," Adrian said. "I also want to address Marcus Webb's statement directly because you're entitled to know what you're responding to." She turned a page in the folder. "Mr. Webb has claimed that in a conversation approximately 18 months ago, you discussed the LLC structure and indicated in his characterization that you were aware of mechanisms within the discretionary account that could be used for, and I'm quoting his language here, off-record operational flexibility." Adrian looked at her. "That's false. Can you tell me about any conversation 18 months ago that might have been mischaracterized in that way?" He thought. 18 months ago. He could place himself there with reasonable accuracy, could reconstruct the general shape of that period. The Morrison contract negotiations, the cybersecurity division's expansion into the government sector, a series of board presentations about operational efficiency. He thought about Marcus in those months, the specific quality of his presence, the CFO who always had the number, always had the answer, always had the next step ready. He thought about one dinner in particular, Marcus's house. Late in the year, a Friday night, the two of them on the back patio after Marcus's wife had gone inside, the kind of conversation that happens between men who've worked closely enough together that the professional and personal are no longer separable. Marcus had said something about the company's growth creating structural rigidities, his phrase, structural rigidities, and Adrian had said something about needing to stay nimble, needing the ability to move fast when opportunities required it, and they'd talked about the discretionary account structure and whether the threshold needed adjusting. He told Flores this, completely, with every detail he could reconstruct, including the parts that were unflattering, that he had, in that conversation, expressed support for the principle of operational flexibility, that he had used language Marcus could have with sufficient motivation stretched into the shape of what Marcus now claimed. "I did not authorize fraud," Adrian said. "I did not know about the transfers, but I can see how a man who had already made the decision to steal from me might have reached back into a conversation we'd had and found language he could use to tell himself he had cover." He paused. "That's not the same as giving him cover, but I'm not going to pretend the conversation didn't happen." Flores made a note. Castillo made a note. The room was very quiet. Thank you, Flores said. That's exactly the kind of account that's useful to this investigation. They went for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Adrian answered every question. He did not manage the room. He did not apply the instinct to control the narrative. He let the narrative be what it was, ugly and specific and without flattering light. And he watched Flores's face as he talked and saw, incrementally, the particular expression of an investigator who is confirming a conclusion she'd already suspected rather than building toward a surprise. When it was over, Flores removed her reading glasses and set them on the folder. We appreciate your cooperation, she said. Your attorney will be notified of next steps. At this point, we don't anticipate requiring additional sessions, but we'll be in touch if that changes. Marcus, Adrian said. His daughter Chloe. She's sick. I don't know the specific diagnosis, but the treatment is expensive and ongoing. I'm not asking you to... He stopped. I don't have a request. I just thought you should have the full picture. Flores looked at him for a moment. We're aware of the medical situation, she said. It doesn't constitute a legal defense, but it's part of the file. I know, Adrian said. I just needed to say it. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city was wet and gleaming, washed to an unusual brightness, the streets reflecting the post-storm sky with the clean clarity of a surface that had been stripped of its usual layer of accumulation. Adrian and Desmond stood on the sidewalk, and Desmond said, "That was well done." And Adrian nodded and did not say anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. Marcus Webb pleaded guilty 14 weeks later to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of misappropriation of corporate funds. The plea agreement, negotiated by his attorney and the federal prosecutor, included full restitution, a suspended sentence contingent on community service, and continued cooperation, and permanent removal from any financial officer position in the securities industry. The judge, reading the sentencing statement, noted the mitigating circumstances of the medical situation, but was clear that mitigation and exoneration were different categories of response. Chloe Webb was 23 and did not know the specific source of her treatment funding until her father told her himself the night before the plea was entered, in a conversation that lasted 4 hours and that Marcus would later describe to his attorney as the worst and most necessary thing he had ever done. Adrian was not present for the plea. He read about it in the Herald's business section in a story on page 6. The federal investigation of Adrian Vale concluded without charges 11 weeks after the session with Agent Flores. The determination was brief and unambiguous. No knowledge, no authorization, no culpability. It was mentioned in a paragraph at the bottom of the update story that ran when Marcus's plea was announced. Desmond called him when the determination came through. "It's done," Desmond said. "Okay," Adrian said. "You should feel..." Desmond paused, which was uncharacteristic. "Something. You were cleared." "I know," Adrian said. "I do feel something. I'm just not sure relieved is the right word." "What is the right word?" Adrian thought about it. "Tired," he said. "I feel tired." He had been staying in a furnished apartment in Coconut Grove, smaller than anything he'd lived in since the Coral Gables studio, with white walls and secondhand furniture and a balcony that looked out over a parking structure rather than the bay. He'd chosen it deliberately, the same way he'd made most decisions in the past several months. Deliberately, without the automatic reach for the most expensive version of the thing. Because the automatic reach for the most expensive version had been, he understood now, a symptom of something he was no longer interested in treating with the same medicine. Sandra Reeves had been running Vale Nexus for 11 weeks, and the company was, by every available metric, doing fine. Not dramatically better, not dramatically worse. Fine, which was the appropriate word for an organization that had absorbed a significant shock and was being managed steadily through the aftermath. Sandra was not Adrian. She made different decisions, moved at a different pace, had a different relationship with the board. Some of it Adrian disagreed with. Most of it was simply different, and he was learning, slowly, imperfectly, to sit with the difference without reaching to correct it. The board had not discussed his return to the CEO role. That conversation was scheduled for the end of the 90-day period, which was still 6 weeks away. Adrian did not spend significant energy anticipating it. He spent his energy on other things. He was at the hospital on a Tuesday morning in late June when Sophia Vale arrived. She came into the world at 6:42 a.m. after 14 hours of labor, and she was 5 pounds 11 ounces and had Elena's nose and a quantity of dark hair that the nurse described as impressive, and a cry that was, in Adrian's experience, the loudest sound he had ever heard produced by anything that small. He was in the room. Elena had allowed it. Allowed was the word, chosen with precision by Patricia Holmes' office in the amended co-parenting framework, which specified Adrian's presence at the birth as Elena's decision and recorded her decision as yes. He stood at the side of the room where he'd been told to stand, out of the way of the medical team, present but not central, which was the right configuration and which he understood as such. When the nurse placed Sophia in Elena's arms and the room settled from controlled chaos into something quieter, Elena looked at her daughter for a long moment, the look of a woman who had carried something through the hardest months of her life and had arrived intact at the other side of it. And then she looked at Adrian. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room. He looked down at Sophia, who was red-faced and furious and entirely herself. And something in his chest performed the action it had performed when Elena first said that same release, that same giving way, but larger now, more complete, the sensation of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time finally understanding it could let go. "Hi," he said, to the baby. Just that. Elena watched him. He could feel her watching him, not with the vigilant, measured attention of the past months, the attention of a woman protecting herself, but something different. The attention of a woman trying to determine, with fresh information, what kind of man was standing in front of her. "Do you want to hold her?" Elena said. He looked at her. "Is that okay?" "I'm asking," Elena said. "So yes." The nurse helped him position his arms. Sophia weighed almost nothing and simultaneously weighed more than anything he had ever held. She smelled the way newborns smell, like something that had arrived from somewhere no one could describe. And she looked up at him with the unfocused vision of someone experiencing the world for the first time and finding it enormous and inexplicable and entirely worth the trouble of arriving into. He stood holding his daughter while Elena rested and the room was quiet around them. And the Miami morning came through the window at the low angle it came at in late June, warm and horizontal and without judgment. He understood, standing there, that this was what remained when everything else was stripped away. Not the company, not the apartment on the 42nd floor, not the stock price or the board meetings or the professional architecture of a life built to signal arrival. Just this, a small warm weight in his arms, and the woman on the bed who had survived him, and the knowledge that what he did next would be the truest account of his character he had ever produced. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in September. Patricia Holm and Desmond Park handled the last of the paperwork in an office in Brickell, and neither Adrian nor Elena was required to be present in the same room for the final signatures, which was how Patricia had structured it, and which both of them understood as a courtesy. Adrian signed his documents at 9 in the morning. Elena signed hers at 2 in the afternoon. The asset division was fair, not generous to either side. Fair, which was the appropriate word for a settlement negotiated by two competent attorneys on behalf of two people who had arrived, through the specific damage of the previous 8 months, at a shared understanding that the goal was not to win, but to end well enough that what came after could be built on something stable. Adrian kept a minority equity position in Vale Nexus and his founding board seat. The penthouse on Brickell was sold. Elena received a portion of the proceeds that, combined with the structured settlement, gave her and Sophia a financial foundation that did not depend on Adrian's goodwill, which had been Elena's primary requirement, and which Adrian had agreed to without argument because it was right, and because it was the least expensive form of the accountability he owed her. He moved into a house in Coconut Grove. Not large, not a statement, just a house with a backyard and a spare bedroom for the nights that Sophia was with him, which under the co-parenting agreement were 2 nights a week and every other weekend and would expand as she grew. He bought furniture carefully, without a stylist, spending more time than he'd expected in stores where no one recognized him, sitting on different chairs, considering what he actually found comfortable rather than what conveyed the right signal to a room. He bought a Meyer lemon tree for the backyard. He did not tell Elena about the tree. It wasn't for Elena. It was for himself. A private acknowledgement, a marker of the version of himself he was trying to locate and reconstruct, not to return to, but to build forward from. The tree was small and would take time to produce fruit, which felt accurate. He planted it on a Saturday morning while Sophia watched from a bouncy seat on the back porch, 3 months old and deeply invested in everything she could see from her horizontal position. He dug the hole with more effort than he'd expected. The coconut grove soil was dense and uncooperative, and he got dirt on his clothes and sweat in his eyes, and at one point hit a root that required 15 minutes of additional work to navigate around. When the tree was in the ground and he'd tamped the soil down around it and watered it, he sat back on his heels and looked at it for a while. Sophia made a sound from the bouncy seat, a particular sound she made when she wanted to know if he was still there, a small interrogative noise that he had learned in 3 months to recognize as distinctly hers. "Still here," he said. He picked her up. She grabbed his collar with the total physical commitment that infants bring to everything, and he walked with her around the small backyard in the late morning heat, and the lemon tree stood in its new ground looking exactly like what it was. Something small and alive that required patience and consistent attention and the willingness to show up regardless of whether the conditions were convenient. He had been back to the board 6 weeks after the 90-day period ended. The conversation was not what he'd anticipated, which had been either a restoration or a final conclusion. Instead, it was something more complicated and more honest. A 3-hour session in which the board laid out, with considerable specificity, what they believed Vale Nexus needed in its next phase, and where they believed Adrian's skills and liabilities intersected with those needs. What they offered was not the CEO role. What they offered was a newly created position: Chief Innovation Officer, responsible for the technology and product vision that had been the original engine of the company's value. Without the operational and public-facing responsibilities that the events of the past year had demonstrated, Adrian could not currently manage without cost to the institution. Sandra Reeves would remain CEO. Adrian would report to the board, not to her, which was a structure that required trust from everyone involved, and which both Sandra and Adrian had agreed to in a separate conversation the week before. He'd taken it. Not with relief. Not with the sensation of restoration he might have expected to feel. Just with the practical acknowledgement that it was the right fit for the actual shape of what he was, rather than the shape he had spent years trying to maintain. His first week back in the office, he passed Marcus Webb's former office on the way to a meeting and stopped outside it for a moment. It had been cleared and repainted and assigned to a new hire whose name he didn't yet know well, and there was nothing of Marcus in it anymore. No photograph, no personal item, just the neutral beginning of someone else's occupancy. He stood there for maybe 30 seconds. Then he went to his meeting. He called Marcus once, in October. He didn't plan it. He was driving back from a supplier meeting, and Marcus's name surfaced in his memory with the specific weight of something unresolved, and he pulled over and dialed before he'd had time to construct a reason. Marcus answered on the third ring with the voice of a man who had been waiting for this call for months, and had stopped expecting it. "Adrian," he said. "How's Chloe?" Adrian said. A pause. "She's..." Marcus's voice shifted. "She's responding well. The last scan was good." "I'm glad," Adrian said. He meant it. He'd spent some time examining whether he meant it, and had arrived at the conclusion that he did, which was not simple but was true. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "For the statement. For using your name. That was..." "I know what it was," Adrian said. "You were scared and you made a bad choice to protect yourself. I understand bad choices made under fear." He paused. "That's not forgiveness. I want to be clear about that." "I know," Marcus said. "But Chloe didn't do anything wrong," Adrian said. "And you've been..." He stopped. "Just tell her to get better, that's all." He hung up. He sat in the parked car for a while. The street was a residential one in Coral Gables, quiet in the October afternoon. An enormous banyan tree spreading its particular architecture across the sidewalk with the unhurried permanence of something that had been doing exactly this for longer than anyone on the street could remember. He drove home. Elena brought Sophia on a Friday afternoon in November, which was the transition day under the co-parenting schedule, and she stood in the doorway of his house while he took the diaper bag and the car seat and the particular extensive infrastructure that a 4-month-old requires, and she looked at the house, at what he'd done with it, the simple furniture, the backyard visible through the sliding glass door, the lemon tree in its corner of the yard catching the late light. She didn't say anything about the tree, but he saw her see it. She ate it too, Elena said. She'll probably be hungry again by 6. She's been sleeping better at night, but she goes down better if you walk her for a little while first. The walking seems to help her settle. I know, he said. We've been doing that. Right. Elena adjusted her bag on her shoulder. She was dressed simply, the way she'd always dressed before the penthouse and the galas and the years of being an accessory to someone else's public image. She looked, Adrian thought, more like herself than she had in years. Not lighter. The weight of what they'd been through was not gone and would not go, but more herself. The specific quality of a woman who had come back to her own outline after a long time of filling someone else's. How are you? He said. Good, she said. Then, more carefully, actually good, not fine. Good. I'm glad. She looked at him for a moment. Not the measuring look of the hospital months, not the flat, careful look of the divorce negotiations. Something that had less defense in it. The look of two people who had been through something together and were standing on the other side of it, changed in ways that were not recoverable and not entirely regrettable. She's starting to smile, Elena said. Like, actually smile, not the reflex thing. You might see it this weekend if you're lucky. Okay, he said. Okay. Elena reached out and touched Sophia's hand where it rested on Adrian's arm. A light touch, a reflex of connection, the gesture of a mother checking on her child even when the child was already held. Her fingers brushed his arm in the process, and neither of them acknowledged it. She stepped back. I'll pick her up Sunday at 4. I'll have her ready, he said. Elena nodded. She walked to her car, a practical sedan, nothing like the vehicles she had driven from the penthouse, nothing like the life that had required a certain kind of car. And she got in and drove away without looking back, which was how she did most things now, forward without looking back, without the hesitation that had defined so much of the years she'd spent adjusting herself to fit someone else's comfort. Adrian stood in the doorway holding his daughter and watched the car until it turned the corner and was gone. Then he went inside. He fed Sophia at 6, the way Elena said, and she ate with the focused intensity she brought to everything that mattered to her. He walked her for 20 minutes in the backyard in the cooling November evening, past the lemon tree that was doing what it was supposed to do. Not producing fruit yet, just growing, establishing its root system in the new ground, learning the particular soil of this particular yard. He walked her and she settled, gradually, her grip on his collar loosening as the rhythm of his movement did what Elena said it would do. He put her down in the crib in the spare bedroom that he'd turned into her room. Not with the assistance of an interior designer, not with the best of everything, just with careful attention to what she might actually need. A mobile that moved slowly, curtains that blocked the light effectively, a rug that was soft when he was on his knees beside her. She looked up at him from the crib with her mother's eyes in his face's general architecture, and he looked back at her, and she did the thing Elena had described, the actual smile, not the reflex, the one that came from somewhere conscious and deliberate, a small person reporting on her experience of the world. He smiled back. He stayed there for a while after her eyes closed, one hand resting on the side of the crib, listening to her breathe in the way that parents listen. Not anxiously, or not only anxiously, but with the particular quality of attention that a person reserves for things they have understood to be irreplaceable. The house was quiet around him. Outside, Coconut Grove conducted its evening. The particular sounds of a neighborhood that had been here longer than most of Miami, old trees and old houses, and the specific unhurried rhythm of a place that had never needed to announce itself. He could hear the street through the window, and beyond it, faint but present, the sound of the bay. He went to the kitchen and made himself something to eat, standing at the counter rather than sitting at the table, looking out the back door at the yard in the dark. The lemon tree was visible in the light from the kitchen, a small shape in the corner of the yard, doing its quiet work. He thought about Harriet Ewan's voice on the phone the previous week, confirming the details of his return arrangement with the measured satisfaction of a woman whose bet had not entirely paid off, but had not entirely failed either. He thought about Desmond's office, the yellow legal pad, the instruction to tell the truth. He thought about Agent Flores and the conference room, and Marcus's face across the kitchen island, and the word sorry, and what it did and didn't carry. He thought about Elena standing in the doorway, looking at the house with the expression of a woman arriving at a conclusion she wasn't ready to state yet. He thought about Sophia's hand on his arm and Elena's fingers passing across it in the same motion, the layered contact, and the fact that neither of them had acknowledged it because some things didn't need to be made into language to be real. He finished eating. He washed the dish. He turned off the kitchen light and went to sit in the backyard in the dark, in a chair he'd positioned so he could see both the yard and the doorway to the house through the sliding glass. The way a person sits when they have learned, through costly experience, the value of being able to see what they're responsible for. The lemon tree stood in its corner, small and specific, holding its ground. He sat with it for a while. The night was warm, the way Miami nights were warm even in November. The air with salt in it coming off the bay, the sky showing its stars through the usual ambient light of the city. He sat and breathed and did not think about the stock price, or the board, or the co-parenting schedule, or the investigation's conclusion, or any of the machinery of the life that had been built and partially dismantled and partially rebuilt in a new configuration over the past year. He thought about a man at 29 with $40,000 and a pull-out couch and a 12-page business plan, and he thought about the distance between that man and this one, and for the first time in a long time, he was not sure which version was further from where he actually needed to be. Maybe neither. Maybe both were points on a line that was still extending, still in motion, still finding its direction. He sat until the night deepened and the lights in the neighboring houses went out one by one. Then he went inside and he checked on his daughter one more time, still breathing, still sleeping, one small fist pressed against her cheek in the posture of someone entirely at peace with the world she had arrived in, and he went to his own room and lay down in the dark and closed his eyes. He slept. Not well, not deeply, not without the residue of everything the year had deposited, but he slept, which was more than he'd been able to say for most of the months behind him. And outside in the backyard, the lemon tree stood in its new ground in the dark, and the bay was there beyond the houses and the streets, and the city turned in its enormous orbit without judgment, and morning was already on its way. It always was.